what we covered on Monday. We talked about quotas. We looked at quotas versus tariffs, and we said the major changes, as I just said, the difference in what the effect is on trade as a result of a quota versus a tariff. And that we see that the domestic response to an increase in demand under a tariff is what? An increase in imports, as opposed to under a quota, an increase in demand is the result of under quota, the response to an increase in demand is an increase in domestic price and an increase in domestic production. We also talked about export quotas, two-tier tariffs, and domestic content requirements. We're going to review that briefly. Before we do, though, I'd like to go to the slideshow, and I'd like to talk about a data point that came out yesterday on job openings. Yesterday, we had the JOLT survey. The JOLT survey is a monthly report on job openings, labor survey, labor turnover, and separations. Separations means people that are leaving the workforce. Either they're being let go or they're quitting. If you look here, look at the headlines. Yesterday, we saw U.S. job openings jump to 7.37 million. They're higher than they were before the pandemic. They're at a two-year high now as the economy surges. And the single biggest threat to the labor market's coronavirus-induced job loss, we now see is beginning to slow. So, like I said, every month we get the JOLT survey. Let's break this out and look at this a little bit more closely. If you look at the bottom left of the slide, you see that quits were 3.4 million. That means of the labor force, 2.3% of the labor force quit, 3.4 million. Turnover in the labor market was 5.5 million, which includes the quits, layoffs, and discharges, which is 1.7 million, then other separations. You see that hires, total hires for last month, for the month of February, was 5.7 million. The excitement, though, is over the job openings number of 7.4 million, which is a jump from the month before, about 7.1 million. The overriding concern, of course, is that we still have 9.7+ million people unemployed, fewer than were employed before the pandemic. Nevertheless, there are reasons to be optimistic. Let's break this out further, if you will. If you look at job openings here, what do you see? You see that since the Great Recession, there's been an increase in overall job openings until we saw a peak in November of 2018 of 7.6 million jobs. So other than the anomaly of the pandemic crisis here, we see that job openings are recovering to where they were before the pandemic. In terms of total hires, again, what do we see? We see the same trend. We see the anomaly of the coronavirus, the pandemic, the crisis, health and financial crisis, but that as we're making our way through that hiring is starting to recover as businesses are reopening. If you look at layoffs and discharges, what's the takeaway here? Well, the takeaway here, again, is the extraordinary scale and scope of the coronavirus crisis that we see that in a span of a couple of months, we lost 23 million jobs, as we discussed, we've been discussing throughout the semester. But again, that's behind us now, and the economy is, the labor markets are returning to what would be considered a longer-term trend. Most importantly, though, I want to look at the quits rate with you. What's the quits rate? If the quits rate is low, it means that people feel what about leaving their jobs?
They don't want to quit their jobs.
If the quit rate is low, it means exactly, of course, that people are nervous about leaving. The higher the quits rate, the more positive people are about leaving their jobs. So if you look at before the Great Recession, where was the quits rate? Around 2.3%, right? For a healthy economy. Well, again, we see the anomaly of the pandemic, what it did to the quits rate, which just collapsed. But over the longer term, since before the Great Recession, we saw that as a result of the Great Recession, we see a significant contraction in the quits rate. And since the end of the Great Recession, we see that the quits rate has recovered. Yes? Then we see the quits rate collapse, and now it's recovered again to where it is now at about 2.3%. So it's following an expected course. And the stronger the quits rate, the stronger the economy is. And so the fact that the quits rate is back where it was before the Great Recession, and of course before the pandemic, is a very encouraging sign for the labor markets. And it dawned on me also an encouraging sign for students who might be graduating, or for students who are working and maybe looking to change a job. I'm a firm believer that there are opportunities in down markets. When I came out of school, it was the S&L crisis of the late 80s and the beginning of the 1990s, and I managed to do very well in that environment. There's always opportunities for young, talented people, which of course all of you are. That being said, it looks as though for those of you that are graduating, you're really going to be coming out in a gangbusters economy. In fact, I know that Jamie Dimon issued a note this morning for Jamie Dimon is, can someone tell me?
President of Citibank?
JPMC.
JP Morgan Chase. So he runs JP Morgan Chase. And does anyone know what his note was this morning? The note was that he expects in a market note that he expects the expectation is by him and his team is that we should see really significant growth well through 2023, which of course is a very positive to hear from a business leader like him. Are there any questions here about the JOLT survey? The next JOLT survey should come out. Just let me jump in. The next JOLT survey for March should come out in the beginning of April, around the 9th or the 11th, not between the 9th and the 11th. What was the question?
I have a question about the frequency. So if you look at the line, you see that there are little like frequent spikes. Are those because of seasonality?
I'm sorry, were you looking on the quits
So
rate?
yeah, on the quits rate, if you just look at it, it goes straight.
You're looking at seasonality. That's right. You're looking at seasonality.
Professor, just a quick question. So when the quit rate drop, people tend not to leave the job?
That's exactly right, Guy. In other words, a lower quits rate means that people are afraid about losing their jobs. The higher the quits rate, the more comfortable, the more confident they are in the strength of their economy and their ability to get a new job. The higher the quits rate, the stronger the sentiment is for the market, right? The stronger the labor market.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So let's take a look at what we talked about the other day. I want to do a review because you have a quiz next week. I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. We're going to run through this quickly. An absolute quota is just simply a physical restriction on the quantity of goods brought into the country. Whoever has the right to sell those goods in the country will benefit from the windfall profit of quota rent. The government typically allocates licenses either on a pro rata basis or via an auction methodology. The preferred method for the government is the auction methodology. Why? Because that way they generate revenue. Next, we talked about a global quota, which is a specified quantity of goods that can be imported into the country. So if the US says we can import 30 million apples over the course of 2021, that's an example of a global quota. A selective quota means that individual countries have been selected to export those 30 million apples into the US over the course of 2021, allocated, as we looked at the other day, between Mexico, Chile, a few other countries, 10 million here, so on and so forth, 10 million, 5 and 5, and then another set of numbers. Excuse me. The point is that we just show that a global quota plus a selective quota would mean that you said 30 million apples can be imported over the course of the year, and you've selected 4 or 5 countries among which that 30 million apples is assigned to be exported into the United States. We talked about the distribution of the quota revenue between the price between the exporter, the importer, and the consumer. And we used the example of the EU and the United States. And we said that if EU exporters act as what? They act as a monopoly seller against competitive buyers. Well, then what's going to happen? The windfall profit or quota rent is going to accrue to the European exporters. If, on the other hand, US importers join together and become a unified buyer, become a monopoly buyer against competitive sellers, well, then the windfall of profit rent will accrue to domestic sellers who will be able to pay whatever the lowest world price is for the product that they're importing. Okay. Any questions on this before I move on? Okay, just a review. Again, we talked about the government selling import licenses and capturing those windfall profits, which is a source of revenue for the government. We then introduced the idea of the tariff rate quota, which is a two-tier tariff. So there's there's a quota amount that can be imported within the quota tariff rate, and for any imports above that quota, there's the over the quota tariff rate. What's the problem with the system, though? Is that typically the over the quota tariff rate is prohibitively high, which prevents anything else from being imported into the country. We've seen this frequently in the agricultural market. Particularly, I've mentioned to you twice now, we've talked about the disconnect in the sugar markets. Getting back to the methodology, though, the mechanics of a tariff rate quota, the way in which the right to sell into the U.S. market is allocated is typically on the license on demand allocation, which is one of three ways. It's either if the demand is lower than the quota, it's a first come, first served basis. If it's higher than the quota, then it's a proportional reduction, or it's going to be via an auction, which is the government's preferred methodology, of course, again, because they are able to generate some revenue. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So now we talked about voluntary export. We then talked about VERs where nations are willing to, was there a question? Where nations are willing to moderate the intensity of international competition. So we use the example of Japan in the 1980s entering into an agreement with the US to limit their exports into the US market. Well, it was great for them because what happened? The windfall profit of quota rent accrued to Japanese automakers. Who loses in all of this? US consumers who paid more for every car that they bought from the Japanese. We then talked about domestic content requirements, which say that a minimum percentage of goods value must be produced locally in order to qualify for zero tariff rates. And we use an example of a domestic content requirement imposed on Japanese automakers who had to move their production to Australia. And in fact, we're going to look at that slide a few down from here, so I'm not going to get into that right now. Are there any questions on DCR? No? Okay,
Professor,
good.
Sorry, I do have
No,
a
it's
question.
fine. Go ahead. Sure. What's up?
Not on a DCR, but the previous one. Can you explain again why Japan got benefited by the export?
Because they're able to sell more. They're agreeing to moderate their competition into moderate their exports into the U.S. They were able to sell their cars at a higher price, and they sold fewer cars, but they sold it at a higher price. Why did Japan agree to this? Why does any nation agree to a VER from, let's say, the United States or another major importer? Because they'd rather follow the VER request than to potentially suffer greater consequences, like some type of trade war, or more severe penalties being imposed by the importing nation. Is that okay there, Nicole?
Yes. So the U.S. Didn't got benefited, or yes, so because of the selling of the Japanese car here, or it was just the Japanese?
It's just the Japanese car makers benefit. Japanese car makers benefit. U.S. consumers lose because they're paying for more expensive cars.
But what about domestic producers?
Pardon me?
What about domestic producers? Are they benefiting that as well?
They probably lose.
Domestic producers are going to benefit because they're able to produce more cars. They're able to sell more cars more expensively. Of course, they're going to pay more. Consumers are going to pay more for imports and more for domestic cars. So it helps domestic consumers. So you see increasing producer surplus and you see decreasing consumer surplus because consumers are paying more money both for domestic cars and for imports. Absolutely. Sure.
It's a win-win situation for both Japanese producers and American producers.
It is, but it's a lose-lose situation for American consumers.
Okay, got it.
That's a good point. Thank you. Very good. Thank you all very much. Okay, so let's look here and review where we were. We said here we were, the country was producing 1 pound of cheese. It was consuming 8 pounds of cheese, and it's importing 7 pounds of cheese at the EU price of $2.50 a pound, right? We said the government imposes the 3 pound quota, which means that the overall supply is going to be The domestic production of 1 pound plus the 3 pounds gives us 4 pounds. We're able to draw our quota-induced supply curve, and we can then identify the new price and quantity, which is $5 a pound. And we know that the US is going to increase its production to 3 pounds, which with the 3 pound quota gets us to our 6 pounds, which ties out directly to where our graph took us. Okay? And so now we can identify our welfare effects. We have the transfer of consumer surplus to the producers. We have our protective effect for the cost of more expensive domestic production. We have the consumption effect because of lower consumption due to higher prices. And then, of course, we have the revenue effect, which is your windfall profit or quota rent. And all of these numbers, of course, we can quantify. We then went on and we took a look at comparing tariffs versus quotas. And what did we say? We said that if you have a $1,000 tariff, that took us here on the left side of the page from 6,000 to 7,000. We saw domestic production increase, overall consumption falls as we would expect, and imports shrink from 7 to 3 million cars. If there's a 3 million car quota imposed, well, then with that quota restriction, the US is in exactly the same position as it was under the $1,000 tariff. As I point out here, the import quota of 3 million puts the US in the identical trade position as it was under the tariff. Then what we said was, what happens if demand changes? Well, if demand changes under the tariff, you just see an increase in imports at the tariff-induced price. With the quota restriction, you can't increase the imports. They've already been satisfied. So you see an increase in domestic production from 3 to 4 million cars, and the quota stays the same at 3 million cars. That gets us to 7. And the price now is increased from 7,000 to 7,500. So again, a benefit to domestic producers and a big loss for domestic consumers, much more so than under a tariff restriction, which is much less restrictive than the quota. Finally, we talked about domestic content requirement, and we saw that Toyota is selling 500 cars in Australia at 24K a pop. And so we're able to identify the income to Japanese resource owners here as C plus D. Then we said that Australia imposes a domestic content requirement on the car company. And so the car company moves its operation to Australia, which represents what? A loss to Australian resource owners and a loss to Japanese resource owners, which is what they lost here. The income to Japanese resource owners is lost. But what's the gain? There's a gain for Australian resource owners, which is A plus C. But because of the additional $9,000 in costs, we know that there's a loss of consumer surplus. Well, first there's the transfer of consumer surplus to producers, which is your cost of inefficient production here, A. And then you have your deadweight welfare loss, which is B, caused by the higher prices, which leads to lower consumption from 500 to 300 units. Are there any questions here about these welfare effects? Okay. Now let's talk about some new material. Let's talk about production subsidies. Okay. So subsidies, as we say, is an alternative to quotas and tariffs. They're granted to import competing producers. It's used to encourage output and strengthen the import competing domestic industry. It provides a cost advantage that allows domestic producers to sell their products at lower prices. So if the government says on every unit that you sell, we're going to give you 50 cents. Well, you can lower your price and still protect your profit margin. Okay? If as we're going through this, there are any questions, please jump in. So an example of a subsidy can be something like a cash disbursement, a direct cash disbursement, like I said, 50 cents per unit, direct tax breaks. It can be some type of insurance. And of course, it can be subsidized loans. So what are the welfare effects? Well, the welfare effects is increasing producer surplus for more efficient U.S. consumers and decreasing consumer surplus for domestic consumers. The protective effect occurs, of course, because more expensive output is being sold domestically. There is a deadweight loss of welfare. I just said the wrong thing. There's no consumer. There's a transfer of. Pardon me. What I said was the transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus is right. What there is none of is there's no consumption effect. The subsidy doesn't interfere with the markets the way a tariff or a quota does, okay? There's no consumption effect. So you get the same result as a tariff or a quota, but it's at a much lower cost to the nation, okay? So I said there's a transfer of producer to consumer surplus, but in terms of consumption, there's no change in consumption because the subsidy is direct payment to the producer. Subsidies don't distort the market and don't distort consumer choices the way that tariffs and quotas do. Okay, so export subsidies are granted to domestic producers of products that are sold overseas, which allows firms to sell their goods at cost or below their price target. So what happens? It leads to higher output prices for exporters, but lower domestic consumption because the price is higher in the U.S. The government says, we're going to give you a dollar a unit for every item you sell overseas, but not domestically. So if you're the domestic producer, where are you going to sell as much as you can? You're going to sell it overseas. You're not going to sell it in the U.S., right? And therefore, you're not going to sell it at a lower price in the U.S. Therefore, your domestic consumer is going to push back, but you don't care because you're going to get money from the government for everything that you sell overseas, right? So what it leads to is lower consumption. So you've got domestic producers who are gaining at the expense of domestic consumers and domestic taxpayers. Why domestic taxpayers? Can someone tell us?
That's where subsidies come from.
That's exactly right, Michael. Thank you. Because somebody has to pay for the subsidies. They're not free goods. They have to be paid for. That's a good point. Thank you, Michael. So the welfare effects includes the increasing producer surplus and decreasing consumer surplus. And of course, again, that there's no consumption effect, which is the key difference with subsidies, as we've now said a couple of times. So let's take a look at some graphs. Pardon me. So here we see the steel market in the US. We say that at free trade, the US is producing 2 million tons of steel and consuming 14 million tons of steel. The autarky price in the absence of trade was $4.30 a ton. Free trade, though, it's $400 a ton, which is great, right? The US grants a production subsidy of $25 per ton of steel. So right away, you know what? Intuitively, domestic production is going to increase. Remember, it's going to have no effect on consumption because the money that's being paid is being paid directly to the producer, right? So domestic production increases from 2 to 7 million units, and overall consumption stays the same at 14 million units. So we now have our subsidy-adjusted supply schedule, and again, the domestic subsidy leads to increased production and reduced imports from 12 million units, 12 million tons of steel to 7 million tons of steel. So the cost, the price to the steel maker is the domestic price, which is $400 plus the $25. So the domestic producer is getting $4.25 per ton of steel. Okay. So the cost of the subsidy is the total number of imports, the 7 million tons times the $25, which is $175 million. For every ton of steel, the U.S. got $25 per ton. So that got them $175 million. Okay, which is a way to support domestic industry. So your producer surplus increases here, which is 112 million. It's your transfer of consumer surplus to your more efficient domestic consumer producers. And then, of course, you have your protective effect, which is the deadweight welfare loss as more costly domestic output replaces cheap foreign imports. Because you went from 430 to 400 back to 425, and somebody's paying for this. The taxpayer's paying for this. Any questions on this?
Yes, I do have one, Professor. How does the imports fall from 12 to 7?
Okay, because look, have a look here. Okay, so at free trade, the U.S. is consuming 14 million tons. It's producing, this is the supply curve for the U.S., 2 million tons. That's 12 million tons of imports,
That's what.
right? So once the subsidy takes effect, the U.S. is increasing its domestic production from 2 million to 7 million, which is how we get the subsidy adjusted supply schedule. So that means our imports have shrunk from 14 million to 7 million. Do you see that?
Okay, I see.
Sure. Of course, absolutely. No, of course. Okay, so now we take a look at the export subsidy, which is a bit of a different case. What we said was that here at the world price of $5, the supply in the US is going to increase from 6 million bushels of wheat to 8 million bushels of wheat. Overall demand in the US is going to fall from 6 million bushels of wheat to 4 million bushels of wheat. Why? Because the price is higher, $1 a bushel more. Okay. The US says it's going to give domestic producers another $1 for every export of wheat, every bushel of wheat that's exported, right? So the export subsidy, though, is not available on domestic sales. So as you point out here, the firms are unwilling to sell domestically at a price less than $6 a bushel. Why? Because they can earn $6 a bushel selling overseas. So they move away from focusing on the domestic market and focus on the export market. And so what do we see? We see that domestic supply increases from 8 to 10 million bushels, and overall consumption in the US falls from 4 million to 2 million bushels because of the increase in price. It went from $4 at autarky, $5 at the world price, and then the subsidy adjusted price of $6, which of course is great for the producer, great for the industry, not so good for domestic consumers. Pardon me. Okay. Any questions here?
Oh yeah. So when is export subsidies considered dumping? Is that when it's below world price?
Dumping is, well, there are different types of dumping. We're going to talk about dumping. I think we're going to talk about dumping on Monday. But dumping depends, the margin of dumping depends upon the fair market value, and there's a methodology to determine the fair market value. And there's a variety of mechanisms to address accusations of dumping in the World Trade Organization. As I said, there's a margin of dumping and penalties that can be assessed. In this case, with regard to your question, dumping means that you're selling at below cost. Dumping means you're selling at below cost, or you're selling at below your domestic market price. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, here we say that U.S. wheat producers are gaining at the expense of U.S. consumers and taxpayers, of course, because the subsidy is not free. It's a common tool that's used in the agricultural and dairy products like milk and cheese. Oftentimes, those markets are benefit from subsidies. So if we want to look at the welfare effects of the subsidy on the export subsidy, well, here we have them. We have the lost consumer surplus, which is A plus B here. You have the producer surplus increasing, A plus B plus C, which is 9 million. You have the cost to the taxpayers. Remember, we're producing 8 million. We're consuming 2. That means we're exporting 8 million units. Well, 8 million units times $1 a unit is $8 million. That's the cost to the taxpayers, B, C, and D. And finally, we have your deadweight welfare loss, which is the lost consumer surplus here due to the price increase and the increase in domestic cost producing more wheat from 8 million to 10 million units. And that gives us our deadweight welfare loss of $2 million. Do you want me to go over that again?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Okay, so here we were at autarky. We're producing and consuming 6 million units of wheat at $4 a unit. At the world price of $5, we, the producer, are increasing our production to 8 million units. We're selling less at home because consumers are not as willing to pay $5 a unit in the U.S. Nevertheless, we're dramatically increasing our exports. Now we're exporting 4 million units. The U.S. offers a subsidy of $1 a unit on all exports of wheat. And so therefore, we as domestic producers are going to grab it. We're going to increase our domestic production from 8 to 10 million units. Overall domestic consumption is going to fall from 4 million to 2 million units because, again, consumers are going to push back. They pushed back at $5 a unit. Now they're pushing back more at $6 a unit. And overall consumption falls from 4 million to 2 million units. Overall exports increase from 4 million units to 8 million units, which increased the cost of the subsidy to $8 million at $1 a unit. And we see that we can identify the welfare costs. We know that A plus B, the area below the demand curve and above the price, is your lost consumer surplus. We know our producer surplus increases by the area above the supply, above the supply curve and below the price, which is $9 million, A, B, C. And then we know that the cost to the taxpayers we've identified now is the exports of 8 million units multiplied by the subsidy of $1 a unit, gives us our 8. And then our deadweight welfare losses, which is basically our lost consumer surplus here due to the price increases and the increase in domestic cost because you're producing for $6 a unit as opposed to $5 a unit from 8 to 10 million.
Professor,
Yeah.
why would there be an export subsidy if the world price is higher than the domestic price?
Why don't you see if you can answer the question for yourself? What is the government trying to accomplish here?
More exports.
Right, but who are they specifically trying to help?
The domestic producers.
They're trying to help domestic wheat producers. One way to help domestic wheat producers is give them more money on their overseas sales.
What I'm confused about is they're making more money already by selling overseas than in, oh, is it because
They're making
that
more money overseas and they can make more money overseas. And the government's decided that this is a way to support our agriculture sector by providing rich subsidies. It's not necessarily the best system, but it's a system that we have. One of the problems in Europe, having lived there for quite a few years, is you see, and for those of you that might have traveled in Europe or been to Europe or are from Europe, you know that farm subsidies are very common. And one of the problems with farm subsidies is what do? You get a lot of overproduction. Also, if the government guarantees to buy any production that isn't sold in the domestic or overseas markets, that of course is going to do what? It's going to encourage a lot of inefficient production. So we see that in multiple countries in Europe that abide by very generous farm subsidies. Yamu, you have a question?
Yes. So when the government buys it, what do they do with it?
They store it. They store it. They can resell it. But sure, there are guarantees. There are like the price guarantees on sugar in the United States. In France, of course, there are multiple guarantees on corn and other agricultural products that the government buys. And it's a very controversial subject. And there's a lot of pushback from the farming sector. I know in France, where I lived for about 8 years, with regard to exactly that, overly generous subsidies. Our job here, though, is to understand the mechanics of the subsidy and to be able to qualify it relative to other NTBs, tariffs and other NTBs like quotas, recognizing that it's far less costly in terms of national welfare than either quotas or tariffs or quotas. So moving on from here, we're going to talk about international price discrimination. So what international price discrimination is simply, it's a type of dumping. What it says is that a company, a producer, a domestic producer can take advantage of different price elasticities of demand. It can sell a product at a higher price point in the domestic market that is less elastic than a foreign market that might be less elastic, where he can sell or she can sell or they can dump their goods for lower price, but they can still make money on the products that they may not be able to sell in the U.S. market. Okay, so the domestic
Professor,
exporter.
could you repeat that?
Sure, that there's a way to distinguish between elasticities of demand so that you'll have two different prices. You'll sell a product for one price at home in a less elastic market, and then you'll sell it at a second price you'll sell it at home. You'll sell your good at home where the market is less elastic at one price, and then you'll sell it overseas where the market is more elastic at a different price, at a lower price, but still able to generate revenue. It's a type of dumping.
Is
Okay?
there a specific product you can think of?
Pardon me?
Is there a specific
Steel.
product you can think of? Put an example.
An example of dumping, sure, selling cars at different prices. You can selling cars at different prices in different markets, selling any good at different prices in different markets. I'm selling steel at two different prices in two different markets.
Okay.
Selling steel at a higher price in your domestic market because you can charge a higher price, but then selling steel in a different market at a lower price, but still able to generate revenue
But is it really price discrimination because there are associated costs that takes into effect when you ship the steel?
Well, you're talking about logistics costs. Well, the thing is, it's a very good point, Guy, but the truth is it's easier to distinguish between international markets than it is between domestic markets, and that's because of logistics costs. Okay, so here we say that you can, demand conditions we know differ in different submarkets. So the home market could be less elastic with limited competition versus the foreign market that's more elastic, more competitive. So as I said initially, the company can separate submarkets based upon those different demand elasticities as a way to optimize returns. And Guy, this is your point that you just made, that transportation costs, trade restriction differences make it easy to separate international versus domestic markets. So let's take a look here. We have the total market for steel, and we have the submarkets in South Korea and Canada. Okay, so what do we know? That as a non-discriminating seller, South Korea is going to maximize its profit, producing and selling where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so here, we're at marginal revenue, marginal cost at the green circle. We know that the company is going to sell 45 tons of steel at $500 a unit, at $500 a ton, which is $22,500. The average total cost here is $300 a ton, which is $13,500, a total of $13,500. Now the question is how much did the firm sell in each of its submarkets? Well, if it's a non-discriminating seller, it's going to sell at the same price in both submarkets. All you have to do is draw a horizontal line across, intersect the demand schedule at $500 a ton. And what do you see? You see that you're going to sell in South Korea 35 tons, and in Canada, you're going to sell 10 tons. And we just calculated out it's $17,500 in Korea and $5,000 in Canada. Okay, so this is as a non-discriminating seller, selling at the same price in both submarkets. So what's your profit? Your profit is your $22,500 less the cost of $13,500, means you have a profit here of $9,000. So now the question comes up, well, what if you could distinguish between the markets based upon elasticities of demand, right? So the company is going to maximize by charging a higher price in the less elastic market, which is South Korea, and a lower price in the more elastic market, which is Canada. Well, how do we determine what that is? Well, we can determine the optimal output and price where the horizontal line intersects the marginal revenue schedule here at $200, where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost at $200. Okay? And then we just draw a line straight up into our demand curve, and we're going to sell 25 tons of steel at $700 a unit in South Korea, and we're going to sell 20 tons of steel at $400 a unit in Canada. And what does that generate for us? Well, it generates a $3,000 more generates us $3,000 more in profit of $12,000 versus the $9,000 as a non-discriminating seller. So it's a type of dumping, of sophisticated dumping, but we refer to it as international price discrimination. You're discriminating between price elasticity of demand to maximize your revenue. Okay? Any questions here? Do you want me to go over it again? Do you want to? Okay,
Professor.
let's move forward then. So what's our conclusion about tariffs and quotas? That they involve larger sacrifice of national welfare than the equivalent subsidies we've been talking about this evening. Why? Because they distort choices for consumers more than equivalent subsidies. What do they lead to? They lead to lower imports, inefficient domestic production, and lost consumer surpluses, as we've seen over and over again in multiple examples, versus the subsidies, which yield basically comparable results. What are those comparable results? The desire to protect domestic industry, domestic labor, domestic production at a lower cost in terms of overall national welfare. Okay? Now, as we've been pointing out now for the last while, is that subsidies aren't free goods. They have to be financed out of tax revenues. And finally, we know that tariffs and NTBs cause trade to be reorganized less efficiently with tariffs and NTBs, which I've just said now twice in the same sentence. We'll correct that before I post that for you tonight. Are there any questions here, thoughts you want to come up with? We're going to talk more about this on Monday before we have our quiz next week. But is there anything you want to go over now? Okay, so we're going to leave NTBs aside for the moment, and we're going to do some hedging. So everyone can get out your calculators, please. Excuse me. Okay. So we've got two currency pairs. We've got the dollar against the yen and the dollar against the euro, right? We've also got the spot rate of the yen against the euro. And you know that you have principal of yen 5 million. So the question is, what is the inverse exchange rates? What are the inverse exchange rates for the spot rates you've been given? What's the calculated cross rate for the yen against the euro? What's the potential dollar profit? And what's the return on investment? So you're being asked for 4 items here, okay? So let's take a look at the solution. Well, the inverse exchange rate on the dollar yen, you just flip over the 111,323, gives us yen dollar 0.0090. Do the same thing for dollar euro, gives us euro dollar 1.0983. And yen euro, we get euro yen 124.6727. If there's any calculations you don't understand, please jump in and let me know. So now we want to know what's the calculated cross rate. So the calculated cross rate of the yen euro, we're just saying, well, how many times does the yen go into the euro? We've got the spot rates here. We just set up the calculation here. The 111, the 9105 divided by the 111,323 gives us 0.008179. We want to clean it up to 4 decimal places. So the calculated cross rate on the yen euro is 0.0082. Now we have the yen euro quote here. So we see that there's a disconnect. Well, it's about 2%. Well, that means there's a mispricing in the market. And if we do things correctly with our 5 million yen, we should end up with more yen at the end of the trade than when we began. So let's see what we can do, what we did. We started with 5 million yen. So what are we going to do? Well, we look at the top here. We're going to go counterclockwise. We're going to sell yen on the spot market for dollars, dollars for euros, and then we're going to sell euros back to yen. So in the first case, we're going to say divide our local currency by the local spot rate, gives us $44,914. We're going to sell those for euros. We've got to multiply that times 0.9105, gives us 40,895. And then we've got to sell those euros for yen on the spot market. Which rate are we going to use? You've got to sell euros for yen.
The
We only have one
exchange rate.
You're going to use the inverse exchange rate. Thank you. Who said that? Alec, that's right. Thank you. You're going to use your inverse exchange rate, folks, because that's the inverse exchange rate of it's not a calculated rate, it's the inverse of the spot rate. So you're absolutely right. So that gets us 5,098,429, which is 98,429 more than we started with. Multiply it by the inverse exchange rate of the dollar yen, gives us a profit of $884.17, which is over the 5 million, just about a 2% return. Any questions on this?
Yes, Professor. How do you get the first three, the U.S. yen inverse exchange rate and the 0.0090?
Because all we did is we said US dollar yen here is 111,323.
Mm-hmm.
We said 111,323, and we flipped it over. Right, we just flipped it over. So if you look at the US dollar euro is 0.9105. If you flip it over, you get 1.098. The yen euro 0.008021, put 1 over the 008021 gets you euro yen 124,627. You see that?
Yes, I see now.
Good.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now let's turn our attention away from arbitrage and let's put our minds back on options. Okay. So far we've talked about call options, and call options used to hedge against an accounts payable that global managers use all the time as one of the techniques in a global manager's toolkit to address increasing risk. Interestingly, we're talking about the potential for rising rates, and over the course of the next month or so, we're going to start looking at tools that help global managers to navigate a rising interest rate environment to protect against rising rates. And that's going to be very interesting to look at. I just wanted this to refresh your memory in terms of what we talked about options. If you notice on the bottom, I've added a couple of bits of information here. We talked about option pricing, the Black-Scholes model, which is how we price options. We showed the model, the calculations, which I did not test you on. We said, though, the option pricing takes into consideration the intrinsic value of the option plus the time value. In other words, what's the value of the option if you exercise it now, and what's the value that's not yet realized? The Black-Scholes model assumes that the investor is never going to exercise early because the investor doesn't want to lose what? Doesn't want to lose the time value. Okay. We said that Black-Scholes takes into consideration some very key points: the time to maturity, the spot price, the strike price, the spread between the spot and the strike, the risk-free rate, which is the treasury rate, the corresponding treasury rate, and the underlying volatility. The underlying volatility is measured by sigma, which is the standard deviation. This is going to give you your measure of your volatility of returns. The next letter that we're adding to, or the next data point that we're adding to our toolkit is delta. Delta measures the sensitivity of an options price to a change in the value of the underlying asset. The last Greek letter that we're talking about is theta. And what theta does is take into consideration the decay of the option price over time. What happens to the price of the option as time goes on? And so these three letters, the sigma, the delta, and the theta, represent what we call the Greeks. And what they are is they are tools to assess risk for an option or an option book, an option portfolio. Beyond that, I don't have anything for you on that at the moment. Is there any questions on that? How do we measure risk on an option? These are the three Greeks that help us measure risk on options, on call options and put options. Okay, so moving forward, we look at a put option here. A call option here. This should look familiar to everybody. We know that any spot price greater than the strike price means that the option is in the money and the investor is protected. The investor is fearing higher prices. Well, a spot price greater than the strike price means that the investor's fear has come true and she is in the money if the spot price is over the strike price. If the spot price is below the strike price at expiration, what is she going to do? She's going to let the option expire because at that point, naturally, it's worthless. So let's talk about a put option. A put option gives the holder the right, but not the obligation to sell a fixed amount of foreign exchange within a period of time. So when would you use the put option? You have an incoming receivable that's coming in. You have a Great British Pound receivable, £1 million that are coming in 6 months. And what's your fear? Your fear is that the value of the pound is going to shrink over the course of the next 6 months. And when you get your pounds, what's going to happen? You're going to buy fewer dollars. You're going to be able to buy fewer dollars. So the value of your asset will have shrunk. Well, one of the things that you can do is lock in the price at which you can exchange those pounds now for 6 months hence. Okay, so let's take a look. Just like the put option, the call option's risk is limited to the premium cost as indicated here on the chart. So we know that the put option holder is going to benefit from any spot price that's below the strike price, which means that the investor's fears will have been realized because the spot price is the value of his holdings are lower as a result of a lower spot price. Okay, so we know that the put option holder is going to optimize by buying at a low spot and selling at a high strike price. So when the spot price equals the strike price, much like it is with a call option, the option is at the money. When the spot price is less than the strike price, in this case, it's in the money. And when the spot price is greater than the strike price, it's going to be out of the money. Now you'll notice here that profit occurs once you have recovered all of your premium costs. Once the premium cost has been recovered, everything is pure profit. The premium cost is indicated here. Okay. Much like we saw with call option premiums, put option premiums behave exactly the same way. They're going to be higher when there's a greater spread between the strike price and the spot price. When there's longer maturity on the option, a long-dated option is going to be more expensive than a short-dated option. And of course, the volatility on the underlying foreign exchange, which means you have more of an opportunity to profit. So greater volatility on the underlying. Any questions here? Okay, good. Let's do an example. Oh, what's the point of this slide? What do you see here? You see a call option and a put option. They look like mirror images of one another, right?
Yes.
Thank you. They're mirror images of one another. That's a good way to remember them. Okay, now let's look at a problem. So we got the UK rate and the US rate. What's our problem? The firm has a receivable of 3 months. It's getting pounds in 3 months of £1 million. So we've got the UK rate and the US rate. We have the pound spot of $1.764. The forward rate is $1.754, which means it's soft on the pound a bit. The put option strike on the 3-month put option is $1.75 with a 2 cent a unit premium. The expected spot rates as generated by the company at the time were $1.73, 74, and 78, with the probabilities indicated on the slide. So for forward hedge, we know it's very easy, right? The company can hedge the fear of lost value on its incoming pound receivable by entering into a forward hedge, which means it's going to sell its pounds forward at $1.754, means it's going to generate $1,754,000 in 6 months. You could also do a money market hedge, right? It could borrow against its receivables, right? Borrow against its receivables and invest in the market today. So it would borrow at the relevant rate in the UK, which is 1/4 of the annual rate of 8%. So it's 2%. So you've discounted to get your present value of your receivable, which is 983.92 Great British pounds. You're going to borrow that and you're going to convert it at the spot price of $1.764. That means you're netting at time zero, $1,729,411, which you're going to invest for 3 months at 1/4 of 6.5%, which is 1.625%, which is going to get you in 6 months $1,757,515. Now, the next question that we need to ask as global managers is, what's the break-even rate that would make me indifferent between the forward hedge and the money market hedge? Well, all we do is we set up our equation, our break-even rate, and our present value formula. So we say that our loan proceeds here of $1,729,000, at what rate would I be indifferent between, that would make me indifferent between the money market hedge and the forward rate? That rate is 1.42% for the period of 3 months, or 5.69% for 1 year. How do we get that? 1.42 multiplied by 4 is 5.69. Any questions here? Good. Let's move on then. Let's take a look at the put option. So we have the put option. We know what the strike is. The strike is $1.75. The premium is 2 cents. So at $1.73, is the company going to exercise at expiration?
It should.
It's going to exercise at expiration. Of course it's going to, because it'd rather exercise at $1.75 than $1.73. Because if it exercises at $1.73, it's going to net $1.71. It's already got the option. In this case, it's going to net $1.73, which means it's going to get $1,730,000. In the next case, it's the same case, right? Gets $1,730,000. It's going to exercise. In the last case, though, it's going to let the option expire worthless. Why? Because the option is worthless. If your strike price on a put option is $1.75 and the spot price is $1.78, you're very far out of the money. So here, your net is $1.76, and your total received is $1,760,000. Now we've got to do our probability distribution to find out what the expected value is. Well, just multiply it through, as I've done for you here, the $1,730,000 times the 25% and the 30% respectively, then the $1,760,000 times the 45% means that based upon the put option and all the data that we have here, our expected value is $1,743,500. Finally, we look at an unhedged position, which is you never took Echo 3250, you never developed your global manager skills, and you don't know how to hedge, and so therefore you're exposed to the volatility of the market without any protection. So that means that in each case, you're generating whatever your returns going to be based on whatever the spot rate is. We can calculate through, and it shows that our expected value is $1,755,500 on an unhedged position. And now we look at the various options: the forward hedge, the money market hedge, the put option hedge, and the unhedged position. And what do we come up with? That the best option here is the money market hedge. It's going to generate the best returns for us. Are there any questions on this?
Yeah, can you go back 2 slides?
Tell me when to stop.
Here, great. Okay, so the premium is 2 cents per option, right? Per unit of option. So the expected spot is 173. So why the net received per unit is 173?
Because you exercise, and you exercise at $1.75. So you exercise at $1.75, which means your net on each unit is $1.75 less 2 cents. This was an in-the-money option. In scenario 1 and 2, you've got an in-the-money option. You're going to exercise the strike of $1.75, which means you're netting $1.73 on each unit.
Oh, okay, now I get it. Okay.
Okay, good, very good. Okay, so, okay, that's great. Fantastic. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts, observations? Okay, so here's a summary of where we are in terms of hedging, which we're going to add to over the course of the next month or so while we're still in class. We've got our list of how we hedge accounts payable, buying forwards using the money market hedge and call options, or hedging accounts receivable using forwards, money market hedges, and put options. As we move on over the course of next month, we're going to increase the level of complexity, but for the moment, we're going to stick to quotas. We're going to stick to quotas. We're going to wrap that up on Monday. We're going to finish dumping on Monday. The only thing left that we have to do in Chapter 5 is dumping. So I'm gonna get out of that. Okay, so let's talk about homework. Esteban, I appreciate your willingness to help, but we're not going to need that tonight because we're done sooner than I thought. We made a lot of progress, and I'm going to talk about the homework now, so I don't need a reminder. I'm assigning to you Chapter 5 homework. It's a lengthy assignment. It's 19 questions. Of those 19 questions, question number 7, which covers dumping, you can skip that for now. We're going to cover dumping on Monday. But every other question you should be able to answer based upon just the 2 days of work we've done now. Also, my expectation is you've read the book, but they're very easy questions. The questions, though, that I want you to focus on with a great degree of granular detail are questions 16, 17, and 18 in Chapter 5. So please write that down. Questions 16, 17, and 18. Those are mapping questions with regard to welfare effects, international price discrimination, quotas, domestic content requirement, just what we've been doing now in these last 2 class sessions. That's exactly what your quiz is going to look like. And we're going to go over these questions in very, very minute detail on Monday. So again, Chapter 5, homework is assigned. Question 7 on dumping, you can skip. But I want you to focus most of your efforts, which are the ones that will take it longest. The other questions are very easy, just definition questions, 16, 17, and 18. Again, questions 16, 17, and 18 that you should be focused on for a class on Monday.
Professor.
And like I said, yeah.
So for the quiz, the chapter that we will cover will be chapters 5 and 6.
No, we're just covering Chapter 5 on the quiz, and it's just going to be very focused on a few questions with regard to plotting welfare effects for quotas and other NTBs. I'm going to write the exam over the weekend, so I'll have a chance to talk to you about it on Monday. But like I said, focus on the questions that I identified for you, 16, 17, and 18.
Will we have some graphs there?
You will have graphs. There are graphs. There are graphs that you're expected to draw, and those are the types of questions you're going to see on the exam. I have a note here. I reposted slideshow number 8, which is the slideshow we did on Monday, because some of you came back to me and asked me for more detail on the mapping questions. So if you go back to course documents and you look at international trade number 8, the slideshow from Monday, you'll see that I've added some slides to flesh out the mapping problems, okay, which is what you're going to see on the quiz on Wednesday next. Just looking at my notes, and I don't think I have anything else for you. Anybody else got anything for me?
Professor, is last class posted, the recording?
The last class, Monday's class is posted. It is. It's on all you have to use is the Dropbox link, and it's definitely there. I'm sure of that. Beyond that, I did take some questions. If there's any questions or comments, please send them my way over the next couple of days. I want to wish you all a good evening, a good rest of your week.